And you're listening to Talk at 7 on Lotus FM. A very good evening to you. It is Thursday, the 28th of May, 2026. My name is Shaastra Nagesar. A blessed Eid al-Adha to all those who are observing. We'll be bringing you some special messages a little bit later on. If you do want to send any special Eid messages, you can do so. We'll play them a little bit later. But tonight we are talking a bit about emotional healing. Now, emotional healing is often described as the process that helps us acknowledge, work through, and release past pain. It's not always an easy journey, but it can be deeply transformative and one that leads to a greater self-awareness, resilience, and peace. Joining us tonight is Dorasamy, who will be unpacking the importance of emotional healing and sharing practical insight into how we can begin to move forward or move toward a space of wholeness. She's a wife, mother, and businesswoman and is deeply passionate about encouraging others through life's challenges. Through her message, she inspires people with faith, hope, love, strength, motivation, comfort, joy, and peace. Laiela offers encouragement to anyone who may be navigating emotional wounds or simply seeking a healthier, more grounded way of living. Good evening, Laiela. Thank you for joining us on Talk at 7.
Hi, Shaastra. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Laiela, we'd love to know more about you and what inspired your work as a life coach.
So, I wouldn't even call myself a life coach per se, but what has brought me to a point where I try to assist others on their emotional healing journey is that I've been there myself.
Okay.
And I think when you have walked a road and you have realized how difficult it is to navigate a road without the tools, without the right people, without the right information, and you finally crack it, you get to a point where like, okay, this makes sense. You want to help others. You want to show others how they can also navigate that road. So that's essentially why I do workshops. I do one-on-ones with people just to see if I can help them navigate a difficult path.
Okay. How long has this been part of your journey?
I would say it's been about now 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And so when we talk about emotional healing, it sounds pretty self-explanatory, but I would say it's not. What exactly is it?
I like to explain it from the perspective of we look at emotional, we look at physical.
Right.
So physical healing makes sense to us. So if we get injured, if we need a doctor's attention, we go to the doctor, we get the medication or whatever we need for it. Sometimes we've got to put on maybe a cast or whatever it is, and we go through a process of healing. Emotional healing is pretty similar to that, but the difference is that the pain is felt within ourselves, and it's a different type of pain to explain and navigate, and that is why so often it gets ignored and unattended to.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas a physical hurt, you can't exactly ignore it.
Correct.
And it will heal over time.
It's more obvious.
It is more obvious. Whereas
Yeah.
an emotional one, you can kind of ignore it. It might fester. It might become worse, infected, so to speak, shall we say. So going from there, how do emotional wounds develop over time?
So on that same thought, what happens over time is that when we fail to, let's say somebody had a broken arm and they decided, oh, it's going to get better, and maybe even they did attend to it somewhat, but it doesn't heal properly.
Right.
They're going to constantly have issues with it, and throughout their life it's going to affect them. And then let's say they injure it again, it's going to become compounded, and after a while it's going to be difficult to ignore. And I think it's similar with emotional wounds, where we carry pain that we don't attend to. And it's like, I remember my psychologist describing it as a backpack.
Okay.
She says you take things and you continue to put it in the backpack, and one day there's no more space in that backpack and it just starts to overflow. Yeah.
And at some point you have to figure out how you set it down.
Yes.
Right? So I suppose if we're talking about physical healing, like you mentioned with an arm, you have guidance from your doctor on what's the best way for this to heal so that you have proper functionality of the arm again. But we don't necessarily have that type of guidance when it comes to emotional wounds.
And we should, but it's a sad fact that we don't. I think it's been ignored for a very long time, but more than it being ignored, there's been such a stigma around emotional healing that people tend to feel ashamed about talking about it.
I suppose we think we're supposed to have it together, right? So that if you're going to a psychologist, a therapist, a life coach, then there must be something wrong.
Correct. What I found, so, you asked me when this journey started, and how it actually started for me was my daughter was diagnosed with anorexia in 2022, I think it was. And, we began to understand that it's a mental health issue. It's not, it's an eating disorder, but it's actually a mental health issue.
Stems from.
And there was major depression, anxiety, and we really walked a road with her. But whilst walking that road, I had my own personal journey, and I got to a point where I needed to speak to someone because I felt like I was going to have a nervous breakdown.
Right.
And it started to open my mind around mental health issues. And what I realized when I would share with people, and even when my daughter wasn't well, and I would say to someone, oh, this is what we are going through, they'd look at me completely stunned, like that I was so open about it, because people are very used to these things being hush-hush.
Yes, definitely.
And I would say to my daughter, I'd say to her, please don't feel embarrassed because you are sick. If somebody has cancer, they're not going to walk around feeling embarrassed about it. So we're going to treat it in the same way because it's just an illness and we need to deal with it. It's nothing to be ashamed of. But what I found as I navigated it in that way was I would speak to a friend, for example, and say, this is what we're going through. This is what, we're going to the psychologist. We have had psychiatrist visits. And like halfway through that conversation, I would get people going very like, I actually suffer from anxiety.
Right.
Or I have a family member who's had a nervous breakdown, but it's a big family secret. So, that's when I started to realize just how much of shame and stigma there is attached to mental health issues.
So what are some signs that someone may be emotionally struggling, whether that's hidden, whether it's for someone that you can notice, or even for yourself?
I think the more I navigate and the more I grow and learn and heal, the more I'm able to recognize it in others because it's things that I dealt with myself. So triggers would be a very obvious sign, where somebody reacts or overreacts to something. And you wonder, like, what's going on with them? Or you find that some people just tend to withdraw. Different people deal with things differently. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Some people might actually become very loud and outgoing and like over the top because they're actually putting up this, I am perfect, I am fine, I have no issues. So it can sometimes be very difficult to identify as well, especially in extroverted personalities, because people often feel like if somebody knows what's going on, they're going to judge me. What are they going to think of me? So they try very hard to hide it.
It's a difficult one, right?
Very, very.
So let's go back, because generally, you'd find out a bit more about childhood experiences. Can those experiences shape our emotional well-being as adults, or how do they shape it?
I think from what I've begun to understand and realize, we really underestimate how much our childhood shapes us as adults. And I think a lot of what we deal with as adults is a result of childhood experiences that either we don't even recall. I know there's a lot of times where I even, as I've been navigating my journey, would have a memory and I'd stop and think, is that even real? But our bodies are actually designed to block out trauma until we are able to deal with it. So quite often, people have no memory of things that might have happened in their childhood. And when I say trauma, it's not always something as serious or severe as abuse or, whatever we consider to be severe. It's not always the case, because it could be something as simple sounding to us as being left out of a group in school, or being told by a teacher that you're useless or you're stupid. But these type of things, especially at that very young age, can really impact how we behave as adults.
Right. So with that in mind, how that can affect us as adults, why would emotional healing become so important for us as we navigate our lives?
So everything that we do and how we hear things is based on our own filters. So it's interesting because I can't even remember what it was, but my husband and I were having a conversation earlier, and we were listening to a podcast, and the guy spoke about a cowboy and a fence, and it was something or the other. And I said to him, this is what it sounded like to me. And he says, that's interesting, but this is what it sounded like to me. And we actually spoke about exactly that we hear through our own filters. So when we are heavily traumatized, when we're carrying a lot of emotional baggage, our filters can severely skew what is actually going on around us.
Right.
So even an ordinary conversation or an instruction in a workplace, a relationship,
offensive.
it just completely goes off track, and people are often left wondering, like, what did I say? Like, why is she behaving like this? But we hear it based on our trauma and our filters.
Right. Okay. So then, how do those filters now affect us, or that emotional pain show up, even physically as well as mentally and spiritually? How can it filter through in those different aspects?
So I'll give you a classic example of, let's say there's a little boy named Tommy, and he is 7, and he's on the playground, and they're picking teams for a game.
Okay.
And he's standing there, and he's the last to be picked, and when it's eventually his turn to be picked, the person goes, oh, do I have to pick him? He's so useless. And fast forward 30 years, he's actually a CEO of a company. He's done really well for himself. And he probably doesn't even remember that incident on the playground. And let's say they decide to have a company team building, and suddenly somebody says something about picking teams. He might not remember that incident, and it's very unlikely that that incident would even come to mind. But it would trigger something deep within him that's going to cause him to start to become anxious and uncomfortable.
Right.
He'd probably start drinking a bit too much, or he'd probably start getting irritable and moody around people, and it probably wouldn't even make sense to him. They say that trauma doesn't show up as a memory, but as a feeling.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So if something is triggering you or giving you a feeling that's disproportionate to what's going on,
Correct, yes.
then that's an indication that there's some kind of emotional pain.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. So we can identify this within ourselves sometimes.
You know, we can,
Yeah.
but
because sometimes we might just think, oh, that's really irritating, and we can brush it off as that.
it comes with emotional, it comes with maturity, it comes with very you need to be intentional about it.
Okay.
So when you start, and I know when I started to go on this journey of let's unpack what's going on in me, I would respond or react to a situation, and afterwards I'd stop and think, was that an appropriate reaction? And then I'd question myself and say, okay, why did I react in that way? But quite often, and I think what happens and why a lot of people don't tend to identify these issues within themselves is because they've gone so far down the road of being the victim that it is always everybody else's fault and never theirs.
Right.
And that's where the issue comes in.
Okay, fair point. Now let's go back to Tommy, and now that wasn't a big incident, right? And that can happen on the playground. It's not something that you can avoid.
Happens every day.
It happens all the time,
Yeah.
and we're going to have these instances where a teacher says something, a bit offhanded to you, but it stays with you forever. So how then are we supposed to work through these things?
So there's something called a pain processing journey that actually usually takes place. And this is where we either end up with trauma or we don't. So I'll give you another example. Let's say there's a little girl, we'll call her Lucy, and she goes outside to play with her friends, like how we used to do back in the day. I don't know how many people do that anymore. But, running around outside with the neighborhood kids and playing, and she falls down and she hits her knee really hard on a rock, and she tears her brand new jeans, and her knee's bleeding. She goes into the house, she's hysterical. One of two things can happen. So the first scenario is she walks into the house, the mom is really busy, really frustrated, just fed up, and she sees this child walk in with her brand new jeans that are torn, and she starts to go at her.
Right.
What is wrong with you? Why did you wear your new jeans to play? Are you stupid? Just go upstairs, go and sort yourself out, and leaves this child in this state. And then we have scenario 2 where the mom sees a child come running in, and as it should be, my baby, what happened? Oh my gosh, let's see, let's clean it up. Oh, why did you wear your new jeans? You shouldn't have done that. Oh, never mind. Go and change. It's all patched up. Go, you can go and carry on playing. So the first scenario leaves this pain processing journey incomplete, and that is what ends up as trauma. The second scenario is what a healthy home should look like, where there's love, there's compassion, And that she probably will never, not even remember it. Or if she does remember it, she'll remember it fondly as feeling loved and cared for.
Right. So because she wasn't allowed to process that pain, and then there was added pain from the mom.
Correct.
Then that becomes an injury.
It actually becomes a voice in your head that says, I'm useless, I'm stupid, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough. And unfortunately, those are voices, those are identities that so many people carry around.
They are, and then, we are talking about childhood, but then we also have, lots of instances in adulthood that's going to, do the same thing to you, but I suppose it'll become even more compounded in adulthood.
And I think that's the difference, is when, depending on how you grow up and the environment in which you grow up, you'd either be able to stand up for yourself and say, don't speak to me like that, or I don't appreciate what you just said to me, versus you would take it and be angry with the person for saying it, but not willing to defend yourself. I remember a few years ago, before I got to the point that I am now, I was one of those people that really liked to be liked, and I would very rarely say no to people.
I was just going to ask you where people pleasers fall into this.
I was such a people pleaser, and that comes from it comes from rejection. It comes from feeling not good enough, not worthy. And I remember one day my husband said to me, and it's funny because we can see it in our loved ones, we can see it in our family, our friends, but no matter how often we'll tell them, they will never understand until they see it for themselves.
Right.
And one day he said to me, when you realize your value, you will never let anyone treat you any less. And I often think about that now, and I think it really does come down to us really having a sense of self-worth. But that can only come from silencing all those labels and eliminating them, and really believing that, yes, I am worthy. I don't need you to like me. I need to like myself first.
Yeah. Side note, what a good husband.
I love my husband.
Well, clap for him.
I always say to him, his birthday is on the 9th of August, I say to him that he's God's gift to this woman. No, but he is, honestly. Yeah.
So, it can be a tough thing confronting emotional pain. Why do people generally avoid it?
So as human beings, we are inclined to avoid pain because pain is generally a warning.
Yes.
If you're gonna touch a thorny tree, it's going to poke you, and that says stay away. However, and we seek comfort. So uncomfortable conversations, those type of things, are not really something that anybody is going to willingly explore. I actually heard something interesting. They say that research has shown that the majority of mental health issues actually stem from an avoidance of pain. So we don't want to be honest about how we feel, what we do, so we suppress. We also, think about it, if your friend had to say to you, do I look good in this outfit? And if she looked really terrible in the outfit, how often would we say, maybe try something else? Yeah. We don't want to cause her pain, but we're actually harming her more by not telling her the truth. Yeah. So it is an avoidance issue. And I know there's a book by Henry Cloud that's called How to Have That Difficult Conversation You've Been Avoiding. And he talks about how there's two types of relationships. One is in a relationship filled with love, and the other is a relationship filled with lies. The one filled with love is you always, everything sugar-coated, everything is absolutely, amazing. And that's the relationship filled with lies as well. Yeah. Because you don't want to tell the truth. And then the other one is the truthful relationship, but it's the one where there's always yelling and screaming because I'm not afraid to tell you how I feel, but I will say it very vocally. Right. And there's actually a scripture in the Bible that says that we need to speak the truth in love. And that's where the balance comes in. So yes, difficult conversations or painful things need to be addressed, but when you include love in that formula, it actually has a very positive result.
It's true. And I suppose it takes practice as well. So I fall probably more, where you were talking about with the people pleasing route. But I have a best friend who's the exact opposite, and she will just tell me anything. I remember her telling me once, "You need to tone it down with the hot pink." And I was like, "Okay, fine," But it was like it didn't have to be, a crazy conversation. It was just, in jest almost. But it can be done with love, a bit of humor, and I guess it's just the intention from the person, when
I always joke and I say that's why I have so few friends, because I'm one of those people that can be brutally honest. But I'm thinking about what you said, and I had a boss once, and I remember I bought this really nice, expensive foundation, and I was so chuffed with it. I didn't realize that halfway through the day it used to oxidize, and one day she just looked at me and she says, "I love you, but you are orange."
But you need someone to tell you
need
this.
someone to tell you that. You need someone to tell you that.
So, while we're talking about this, dealing with emotional pain, and generally I find that it's a lot of women who speak about this, right?
Very
So,
often.
when it comes to dealing with men now, they're told to be strong. Good boys don't cry, or strong boys don't cry, and they're expected to suppress their emotions. What does that do to a person? Because it even happens to women, but generally we tend to find it a bit more with men.
So, a very interesting stat. Suicide rates for men are 4 times higher than that of women.
Wow.
And they say generally when women attempt suicide, there's more failed attempts because they go the more, overdose routes that don't usually end in death, whereas men are very determined if they do attempt suicide that they do die, because obviously the shame associated with attempting it is even worse. So I find that from what I've read and from what I've begun to understand is that a lot of men carry deep shame, carry a lot of burden, and there is such a stigma in society around mental health itself, leave alone mental health for men, that they really don't talk about it. And you only realize when it's too late. I mean, we know of a friend that, one of my husband's friends actually, he saw him, I think it was a week or two before, visited him, popped in, probably maybe wanted to speak, but just couldn't bring himself to say, this is what's going on. And 2 weeks later, he killed himself.
Oh gosh.
And, it's so painful, because then you think, I could have helped. I could have said something. What could I have said? Should I have picked it up? But quite often, it's men don't sit around like us women and we'll
Talk
pour
about our
out our
feelings.
souls. Yeah.
Right.
But interestingly enough, I have seen when I did a counseling course a few years ago, and I was very surprised that there were more men in the counseling course attending the course than women. And the facilitator asked them, how come they chose to do this course? And what I loved was each of them had been through a mental health journey themselves. One of them had been through a severe divorce. One was going through grief after losing his sister. They had all been through something, and they said they realized that they needed to equip themselves so that they can help others, because there's so little help out there. So it is being more recognized, and I think more is being done about it, but I don't think there's enough right now.
Yeah, I think the important thing there, especially, is to encourage more men to help men.
I think so, because it's not emasculating if a guy goes up to a guy and says to him, and I think there's such nice ways about it. In fact, my husband actually does quite a bit of similar work that I do with groups of men, and it's as simple as saying, guys, let's meet for a coffee, or let's do something, play some volleyball or whatever, and then they sit around a table, and in general conversation it comes up. And when you're around, I think it's also choosing the people we choose to be around, choosing them well, because when you're around mature men who understand that these are the realities of life, and they themselves are able to be vulnerable and share about challenges they've experienced, it really makes such a big difference, because others are then able to say, oh, me too, I've been there too.
Yes.
Because I think quite often we think we're the only ones.
Yes. But it takes that one person to start and to share.
Absolutely. Like, I know one of the major issues that men tend to face is financial burdens.
Right.
And as a business person, we have our own fair share of those challenges. And we're actually talking about this in a business course that I went to recently, where others were sharing about cash flow issues and, months where they didn't know how they were going to pay their staff and, those type of things. And as they were sharing, I sat there thinking, wow, this is amazing. Others go through what we go through. But quite often, because it's such a sensitive issue, nobody wants to talk about it. But it just takes that one brave soul to say, oh, I'm here and this is what I'm dealing with. And it opens up a floodgate, for others, which is great because then it makes it less stigma around it.
Yeah, that's very true. And social media and that affecting emotional well-being and self-worth. And yes, it can when there's comparison, but there's also a lot that can show you that we're not very different after all. When people share some of their struggles and issues, and then you see more of it, and you're like, okay, maybe we're all living a bit of the same life.
I think so. I think for me, there's such a, like, I have a little bit of a love social media when it comes to this because, like you said, and in fact, we were just chatting about it earlier, that, there is that need to be vulnerable and to share and to be able to talk about what you're going through. But it also needs to be an appropriate audience.
Yeah.
And I'm a person that's quite vocal on social media. I talk about things that I experience. I share a grief journey. I've shared my daughter's anorexia journey, and I've gotten a lot of positive response on that. At the same time, I've seen people share things on social media when they're not quite at a place where they are healed enough to share, and it comes out very differently. And what that tends to do is it attracts a lot more of a negative conversation.
Right.
So, for example, you get people talking about their mother-in-laws on these female groups.
Yes.
And instead of there being a positive response in terms of how to make that relationship better, how to navigate things differently, where is this type of behavior coming from, that sort of thing, all it does is it actually aggravates the situation. When you look at the negative comments that come out of, oh, she doesn't deserve you, or just, don't let her son go see her, and, that type of things. And you can see that that's coming from unhealed people.
Yeah.
So I think it's what different people share and how that response comes across that really, social media can be such a dangerous place. And I think also when we look at social media, people are very bold in saying things that they wouldn't say to somebody's face.
Yes.
So there tends to be a lot of ugliness, especially now with anonymous comments. People can say really hurtful things, and we don't realize how that person on the end of that screen is receiving it. I might read a negative comment, and I heard something so funny. Somebody said, when people respond negatively to my posts, I just picture them sitting on the toilet and typing it. But not everybody has that resilience.
Yeah.
You might get somebody who's at breaking point and something really horrible is said to them online by some stranger who has no clue who they are. And that could actually cause them to take their lives. And, when you look at these documentaries that are done, especially with young people, and what they go through on social media. I mean, I know of a friend recently where her daughter had a little bit of an issue at school with a group of friends. And it went on for weeks on social media where these girls would be posting things, directed at each other. And, one of the ladies that work at a school mentioned, she says, we were in school during a time where...
We didn't deal with that.
None of that. We'd have an argument. We'd go home on a Friday afternoon. We'd have a great weekend, come back to school on Monday, and it was like nothing happened because, we forgot about it by then.
Live
Online, it escalates. So, yeah, social media is another whole topic completely, I think.
Is,
yeah.
It can be very scary, and it can be a very useful tool as well. But we did touch a bit on, or we were chatting a bit on how men can sort of go through those emotions as well. So do men and women experience emotional healing differently?
I would say yes, but I wouldn't just say just men and women experience it differently. I think every one of us experience it differently. However, like we mentioned, men tend to withdraw a lot more, whereas women are much more vocal about it generally. But I think the journey in itself would be quite similar once they embark on it, because there's similar aspects to an emotional healing journey for everyone that needs to be, undertaken.
So before they get to that space where they feel like there needs to be emotional healing, there might be some unhealthy coping mechanisms. What might be some of those coping mechanisms we might see that they're trying to get through something but not entirely sure what it is?
I think that we all, to some extent, have coping mechanisms that are unhealthy, and it's become so socially acceptable that
Like
we don't
binge
see it.
watching.
Whether it's binge watching, whether it's smoking, whether it's vaping, whether it's eating, whether it's
Right.
drinking alcohol, even media has started to recognize that. And if you look at alcohol companies, they'll have a ad of a mom sitting with her feet up, drinking a glass of wine, and saying, "Oh, you deserve it after a long day." But if you've had a long, rough day, and if they're telling you that that glass of wine is you deserve it, you adapting your mind to the fact that I deserve it, not that I'm using this as a coping mechanism. And that's how you get people who are actually functioning alcoholics. And I can speak from personal experience. I've walked down the road of using cigarettes to cope. I've walked down the road of drinking to cope. I've used drugs. It's been when I was a teenager and in my younger 20s. I stopped all of that. I realized that I'm a comfort eater. So, it's sometimes we just switch from one to the next because it makes us feel better. And until we recognize that there's a hole I'm trying to fill that's not going to get filled with any of these things. And, people overwork. Some people, that is their coping mechanism. If they keep themselves busy, then they don't have to think about what's going on. So, there's a lot of things.
So is that essentially what the coping mechanism does? Is it suppresses the emotion so that they don't have to feel it or think about it, but then it's still, the wound is still there, it might get deeper, it definitely is not going to heal on its own.
Yeah, I think generally when anything's unattended, it tends to get worse. And I think that's why you tend to find that in our younger years, we seem to be okay. And when we start hitting our 30s and 40s and when the real pressures of life, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so why is that?
Again, it's the backpack. We keep throwing things in there until it gets to a point where we just can't cope with it anymore. I also think, though, that as we begin to get older, and depending on who we are around, if we are around people who have a level of maturity and who begin to talk about these things around us, then we might start going, oh, okay, maybe this is something I need to address. And even then, I find with like a lot of friends, I've got friends that I chat to that will tell me that they're going through this and they're going through that. And I'll say to them, have you thought of going to see someone? And they'll say, oh, no, I don't need someone. I chat to you every week. I unpack. I feel better. And I'm like, no, but, sometimes it just helps to speak to a professional because they have ways of helping you to unpack these things. It's not, like, for example, grief. A lot of the time we think we are coping. We think we're okay. And, I lost my sister last year. And I was actually saying to my husband the other day, I said to him, I actually noticed that I don't cry for her as much as, I would think I would, but I cry for other people so easily. And I think that's my outlet. Like, that's my way of coping, that I maybe need to actually go and see someone and see if I'm not navigating this incorrectly. It's just that awareness, that self-awareness of realizing something doesn't feel quite right here. Maybe I need to speak to a professional because they are equipped to help us.
Okay, so once, let's say, we speak to a professional, unpacking that, what does that actually mean? Does it mean feeling the emotions and actually crying it out? Does it mean working through it and getting over it? Does it mean identifying that particular issue that happened when you were a child and accepting it? When someone says you need to deal with your emotions, you're like, okay, but what does that mean?
It's all of what you said and so much more. I think it's what a lot of people I think struggle with when it comes to this journey is that it's a journey, and it doesn't happen overnight, and it really does take a lot of work. I run emotional healing workshops, and in like a morning I will unpack as much as I can, but throughout the session I'll be mentioning books and I'll be mentioning podcasts and I'll talk about things that they can do. And at the end of it, I say to them, right, now I've given you all the tools that you need. You now need to go and use them. And it's it's so many different aspects and so many different topics. So, it's about identity, it's about purpose, it's about forgiveness, it's about recognizing where your wounds are, dealing with rejection, understanding who you are and where you belong in this world. There's so much, but essentially it is a whole journey. But Brene Brown wrote an amazing book called Atlas of the Heart. So, you say you need to deal with your emotions and recognize them and all of that. And in her research, she discovered that people, when asked about emotions, the words happy, sad, or angry were the main emotions that people really expressed. Whereas there are, I think she goes through about 80 different emotions in this book.
Wow.
She unpacks them and she distinguishes between them and she helps you to understand what it is you're actually feeling. One of the most interesting things I learned from that book is that excitement and anxiety feel the same. And it depends on how we label it. So if we're doing something, and I always say this to people, I was at an event yesterday and they were pitching businesses. And one of the girls that was pitching was sitting in front of us and she says, "Oh, I'm feeling so anxious." And I said to her, "Anxiety and excitement feel the same. Decide it's excitement, you'll do better." And she looked at me and she just burst out laughing and she said, "Okay, I'm excited, But it's tools. It's learning the tools and teaching ourselves how to respond.
Okay, all right. I'm going to use that the next time I'm going on stage and I'm feeling anxious. I'll say, "No, I'm just excited."
Absolutely.
Okay, so for someone who's listening in and they're overwhelmed, where should they begin?
So I'll tell you where I began and what helped me on my journey. There's a scripture in the Bible, it's Isaiah 61, and it talks about, it says, he says, okay, just to put it into context, when Jesus came to earth, he read in the temple, he read from a scroll, an ancient scroll, and that was Isaiah 61. But in the New Testament, it's found in Luke 4, and this is important. The reason I'm giving you context is because these were the first words that he spoke in the temple, and this is what he says. He says that he has been sent to bind up the brokenhearted and to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. For me, that is so important because it's understanding that I serve a God who came so that I can be healed, so that my life can be better. The Bible says that the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but Jesus came so that we may have life abundantly. And that is what he wants for us. There are, from a practical sense, there are amazing organizations out there that do a lot of great work. And a lot of the times, people can't afford a psychologist or professional help. So focus on the family. They have a whole counseling department. They'll be able to direct them, put them in the right direction. SADAG, they've got a 24-hour call center, and they do practical workshops. I know Amy Naidu does every 2 weeks in Chatsworth. She has at the community center, I think, these group sessions where people can come through and share. So there is a lot of practical things that people can do. I got a lot of help from YouTube. Honestly, I would literally put on my headphones and listen to YouTube all day, every day, and I still do because there's so much that I learn. The main thing that I began to understand is learning to renew my mind. Our thoughts is where it all begins. Before we say anything, before we do anything, we think it, and it's learning to control what goes through our minds.
Right. Okay. So, who are some of your favorite people to listen to on YouTube? Or watch?
I love John Bevere from this perspective because he does some really amazing courses on, there's one on your unique calling where he talks about your identity and purpose. He also does a really amazing teaching called The Bait of Satan, which focuses a lot on things like bitterness and offense and resentment, which are things that really fester in us. He's also done a really nice one where he talks about his addiction to pornography. And it's not just for people who actually have an addiction to pornography, but I listen to it.
Just a coping.
It's again, yes.
Yeah.
But you'll find in that one it's very focused on addiction, any sort of addiction. Yeah. So he's someone I loved listening to. I listened to and I read a lot of Brene Brown, and then Joyce Meyers wrote a book, and I think it's probably 30 years old now. Battlefield of the Mind. It is brilliant.
What are some daily habits, would you say, that can improve emotional well-being?
So I mentioned the mind, and there are two scriptures that come to mind. 2 Corinthians 10:5 talks about taking captive every thought and making it obedient to the Word of God. And what that means is that the Word of God, actually, the Bible continuously talks about how loved we are by God, how special we are. In fact, my daughters both have scripture verses on their bathroom mirror, next to their bathroom mirrors, that remind them of who they are. One is, you are a masterpiece created anew so that you could do the work that God prepared in advance for you to do. And the other one has you are fearfully and wonderfully made. What that does is the Bible tells us to not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. So it's really important that we begin to train our minds on how we think, what we think about, what we accept to be true, because that then guides, as a man thinketh, so is he. So whatever we believe is what we will see in our lives.
Right. So in a practical sense, then, would we start to do a bit of journaling, a bit of meditation? What are some of the practices that we can take up?
So things like journaling and meditation are absolutely brilliant, and I think that different things work for different people.
Okay.
So I went through a season where, and I think it's these terms. People talk about journaling and meditation and all of these things, and then people go, how do I do that?
Yeah.
And I think that's where
some of us haven't written in many years as well.
I promise you, when people talk about journaling, I always go, oh, I don't journal. But if you see the books lying around my house, you would disagree, because I write out prayers. So I pray, but when I am in one of those really bad spaces, the only way I feel better is if I actually write in a book. And it's like writing a letter to God. But that is one of the few things that actually calm me. But you talk about prayer and meditation, and a lot of it is around, again, the mind. But it's also, especially prayer, it's around a belief system. And for me, one of my least favorite quotes is, believe in yourself. Because I always say, when I fail, then what do I have to believe in? So for me, prayer is important because it means that I can believe in someone greater than me, and I can place my faith there and not in myself. And that takes off a whole lot of pressure.
Of course.
Music for me is also something that really makes a huge difference. So I have a speaker in my shower, and every morning and every evening when I get in the shower, I put on praise music. And it has gotten me through some of the most difficult days of my life. It's on those days where you don't even want to listen that you need to listen the most. And I guarantee you will feel at least a little better afterwards.
Okay, fantastic. We just have a few minutes to go before news at 8 o'clock. We'll continue our conversation with Laiela shortly. We are talking about emotional healing, which is often described helps us acknowledge, work through, and release past pain. Not always an easy journey, but it can be a deeply transformative one that leads to greater self-awareness, resilience, as well as peace. We'll continue the conversation with her coming up after 8 o'clock. Shona will have your final news update in 2 minutes.
This child protection.
That was Chalao Naneno and it was Pravesh Kalawan. It's 12 minutes after 8. You're listening to Talk at 7 on Lotus FM. A blessed Eid al-Adha to all those who are observing. We'll bring you some special messages a little bit later on the show. And very good evening if you're just tuning in. It is Thursday, the 28th of May, 2026. We are talking about emotional healing this evening. Now, emotional healing is often described as the process that helps us acknowledge, work through, and release past pain. It's not always an easy journey, but it can be a deeply transformative one that leads to greater self-awareness, resilience, and peace. Joining us tonight is Laiela Dorasamy, who will be unpacking the importance of emotional healing and sharing practical insight into how we can begin to move toward that space of wholeness. She's a wife, mother, and businesswoman and is deeply passionate about encouraging others through life's challenges. So through her message, she inspires people with faith, hope, love, strength, motivation, comfort, joy, and peace. She also offers encouragement for anyone who may be navigating emotional wounds or simply seeking a healthier and more grounded way of living. Laiela, it's been a very interesting discussion thus far, and we still have a little bit more time to go. So let's talk a little bit about, while we're on the topic of emotional healing, what role does self-awareness play in healing?
Thank you, Shaastra. I would say that self-awareness is where I always begin. So when I run my workshops, I actually begin with identity and purpose. And what actually comes to my mind is, I wasn't always this person. I worked for a company, and I think it was, I think it was about 14 years ago, actually, that I had just started work at this company as a manager. And it was quite challenging because the other manager in the office and I didn't get along very well. We were constantly clashing.
Okay.
So my boss decided to take us both on management training, but separately. It was that bad.
Okay.
And I actually met somebody who's actually become a very good friend of mine over the years, a lady named Claire. And she did this exercise where we identify our core strengths and our unique, our unique areas of expertise and all of that. But in this session, she asked a question around the room. How do you see yourself? How do you think your staff see you, and how would you like them to see you?
Okay.
And I stood up and I said, I don't care as long as they get the job done. And the looks around the room were absolute horror from everyone.
Yeah.
And that began my journey of EQ.
Okay.
And beginning to understand, people and emotions and all of these things. And, when we talk about self-awareness, it really is the more you are able to be honest with yourself about who you are, how you see yourself, how others see you, whether it's true or not, it is the best possible way you can grow. So I used to actually look forward to those KPI discussions where they sit you down and go through all your key performance areas and they score you. The first time I went through it, I was so traumatized. I was just like, really, oh my gosh, you feel so judged and criticized. But when I stopped seeing it as being judged and criticized, and I started seeing it as, this person's actually telling me how I can be better.
Right.
And you take it as a challenge and you improve yourself, it makes all the difference.
Okay. And we did touch on this a bit about how we can identify emotional triggers, or maybe we can identify when something triggers us. But then how do we kind of hone that? We just sort of see that, okay, this irritated me a bit. But then how do we take that a little bit further?
So, you make me think of an incident from a few years ago. We are driving and I got a WhatsApp from my pastor. And it said, I am so disappointed in you, Laiela. And I sat there and it was like my heart stopped. Like I couldn't breathe, literally. Like I was like, what did I do? Because I was very much in that people-pleasing space. And like, to hear I am disappointed in you for me is a massive trigger.
Okay.
I mean, I grew up with a dad who, even if I got all A's, then why weren't they in the 90s? It was just never good enough. He would never say, well done, I'm proud of you. I knew deep down he was, and I realize that now that I've healed and I've overcome that. But you don't realize how psychologically it can affect you. So that I am so disappointed in you, Laiela message really triggered me. I was like almost on the verge of an anxiety attack now, waiting to see what did I do wrong. And I was certainly not responding because I wasn't brave enough to ask. And then he messages like a minute or two later and says, "You didn't pick up the typo on this poster." And I was like, why is it my responsibility to pick up the typo? And I replied and I said, honestly, who even noticed that? Like, it's not such a big deal. He says, no, somebody messaged him and said to him, there's a typo.
Yeah.
And he knows that I'm a little bit of like a grammar Nazi, so he would have expected me to pick it up, which was actually a compliment, not so
Yes.
much of a criticism.
Yeah.
And I had this conversation with my husband at the time because I said to him, when I got that message, I was so anxious. And his question to me was, how do you then deal with these triggers? And I said to him, I think it's, over time it lessens, but it's also being aware of them. That once I realize that that is an issue for me, that like when somebody says, I am disappointed with you, it hits me in a place that it's not going to necessarily hit the next person. I need to be conscious of that. And I need to say to myself, this is not that situation, and be able to deal with it. And also understand the fact that I'm going to disappoint people in this world. And it's not their opinion that matters. It's whether I am pleased with where I am and who I am in that moment that matters.
Okay. And where do boundaries fit in when we're talking about emotional health?
Boundaries are so important. And I think you only learn to put those boundaries in. You only become brave enough to actually set boundaries as you continue to grow and understand your self-worth. But it's also understanding that boundaries are a sign of respect for you and the other person. It's managing expectations. So it's really saying to the person, I respect who I am and the space that I need, and I respect you enough to tell you that this is where the line is. And, again, it needs to be done respectfully. And I remember when I was doing a bit of a study on boundaries, the scenario was, I thought I had done very well putting up some boundaries in life until I spoke to someone who said to me, Laiela, there's a difference between boundaries and walls. And I was like totally deflated. I was like, seriously, I thought I was doing so well. And so walls are where we shut people out completely.
Okay.
Boundaries are where we allow there to be a gate.
Okay.
And I'll let you into that gate as long as you respect my yard.
Right.
But if you're going to come into my yard and you're going to tear up my garden, then I'm going to shut the gate and I'm going to leave you out. And I think that's a nice way of actually explaining boundaries, is that when people can respect your space, or when they fit into your space without stealing your peace or affecting you mentally, then you can bring them a little closer. But you can also love people from a distance. And it's really, really so empowering to begin to understand that. Interestingly, the book on boundaries that was also written by Henry Cloud, I mentioned his second book later, after. The second book was written, How to Have the Difficult Conversation You've Been Avoiding, was when he realized that the book on boundaries wasn't enough, because as much as people were excited about trying to set boundaries, they didn't know how to communicate them.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's again, like I said, it's a process and a journey. You might realize I need to set a boundary here, but might not be too sure on how to actually put it out there and let the person know.
You might even be uncertain about what your boundary is until you have a bit of a trigger, right?
Correct. Very correct.
And I suppose you don't walk around saying to people, look guys, these are my boundaries. It's in a moment of conflict or some type of a possible annoyance is when you have to set the boundary. So it can be uncomfortable.
And not only in conflict or annoyance, what comes to mind is a friend invited me a few weeks ago for a get-together. And it was on a Sunday afternoon. So I said to my family, I said, this friend of mine has invited all of us as a family. And they were all like, that sounds great. And I paused and I said, on Sunday afternoon. And everybody just looked at me and went, no. Because Sunday afternoons are our rest time. So we really look forward to, whether we have a nap or not, but really just, preparing ourselves for the week ahead, chilling, family time. And so I said to the friend, no, I'm not going to be able to make it. And that was that. And we had a conversation a week or so in that week. And she said, I know you're busy on Sunday. Enjoy your weekend. And, and I said, I'm actually not busy on Sunday. And I said to her, Sunday afternoons, as a family, generally as a rule, unless it's something really important, we don't do anything. that's a boundary. And it's not because I didn't want to spend time with her. In fact, I had quite a bit of FOMO. I really, considered maybe I should, but I know what I need to get through the week. And if I didn't have that rest, it would affect my week. And I think it's learning those things and being practical and being intentional about what works and what doesn't.
Okay, fair point. So when we obviously as humans going to make mistakes, and we deal with trauma, how do we then, sometimes we find it easier to forgive other people and find it difficult to forgive ourselves. How do we reconcile that and maybe be a little bit kinder and treat ourselves with a bit more grace?
Forgiveness is such a difficult thing. And if you look at the Bible, for example, I always laugh. I say to my kids from the time they were little, if it was Easter, I'd say, why do we celebrate Easter? And they'd chorus, because Jesus died for our sins. And, I think that's a major thing in our society, is that nobody wants to believe that they're a sinner. And we self-condemn anyway, but, it's like such a difficult issue to get around. And I think for me, something that stood out so powerfully recently that I read, and I spoke about Isaiah 61 earlier, but I heard somebody unpack this, and it was so powerful. So in terms of forgiveness, I think this will help a lot of people. I read Isaiah 61 earlier, and I'm just going to highlight this one part. It says, Jesus came to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. Now, I always thought that captives and prisoners sounded very similar because, captives, prisoners, freedom for both of them. But there's actually a difference. Prisoners are normally imprisoned because they've done something wrong.
Yeah.
So they're serving a sentence. Captives are people that are being held against their will and usually haven't done something wrong. So we talk about, for example, somebody who needs forgiveness, needs to forgive themselves. They've probably done something wrong, sinful. But people who've experienced trauma, as you've mentioned, still also feel like they need to forgive themselves, but it's something that's been done to them.
Right.
Now, that's captives and prisoners. Jesus came to set both free. So the fact that there is forgiveness from God for whether you've sinned or whether you've been sinned against, it takes it out of our hands. The fact that He's forgiven us, we no longer need to consider ourselves the person that has to self-damnate. And I think that's where it makes it so much easier for you to move forward from that, because God is ultimately the judge, not us or anyone else.
Is forgiveness always necessary for healing?
Yes. I think forgiveness is something that holds a lot of people back from actually healing, or the lack of forgiveness. I mentioned John Bevere's Bait of Satan, where he talks about the bait of Satan being offense.
Right.
And when we carry offense, it actually creates a whole lot of negative repercussions in our life. But even as simply, and I've mentioned the Bible, I always go back to what the Bible says. God even talks about how if we pray to ask Him for something and we are holding unforgiveness against someone else, that we need to go and forgive that person before we even pray to Him. So just as He's forgiven us, we ought to forgive. And there's many parables in the Bible that talk about that. But I think from a practical perspective, there's a really lovely quote by, I think it's Nelson Mandela, who said, unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I think that sums it up really well.
Let's talk about relationships. How does unresolved trauma affect relationships and communication, and now affect you and the other person?
What happens a lot of the time is that we carry unresolved trauma from one relationship to the next. So when somebody has hurt us or betrayed us or lied to us, we actually go into the next relationship expecting it from that person who has done absolutely nothing to us.
Right.
And that's where we begin to self-sabotage. It's unfair on the other person. It's also unfair to ourselves, because it's really about addressing what that person did. And, we live in a world where there's so much of distrust, and there's so much of, I'm never going to let that happen to me again. We put up walls instead of boundaries. And I think we essentially end up living very bitter, miserable lives if we can't actually work through that trauma and that pain.
So when we go through this journey of emotional healing, it can help to break some of these toxic relationship patterns. And because some people might say they find themselves dating the same type of person over and over again.
Absolutely, 100%. So rejection is a huge topic on its own. And what happens when we experience rejection? So just to give you a perspective, they say that rejection is actually a root. Things like anxiety, depression, all of that are just leaves and branches. So a lot of us deal with rejection, and rejection can come in so many different ways. It can come from just even in the mother's womb. If the mom really didn't want this pregnancy, and you can actually grow up with the sense of rejection from that not being wanted. It can come from divorce. It can come from divorce. It can come from breakups. It can come from a parent saying, "I wish you were never born." There's a lot of ways it comes in, but the opposite of rejection is acceptance. So when we've been rejected, more than anything, we look for acceptance. But often we look for acceptance from that same sort of figure that rejected us in the first place. So you get like men with mother issues, or who look for women who baby them or treat them like children. That's where it comes in. My mother didn't love me, so I'm going to find a woman who will. Women who go after men who treat them badly. They think they're going to fix him, and they're going to finally get that acceptance from that relationship. So it doesn't make sense, but when you start to understand these things, it makes complete sense.
What advice would you give to maybe couples who are trying to heal together? Because I don't suppose anybody really arrives. You're always a sort of work of art and trying to work through whatever it is that you need to work through. So if a couple, they need to work through some of these things together, what advice would you give them?
I'd say start on your own. So yes, you can be there for each other, you can support each other, and you can be conscious and respectful of the other person's healing journey. And I think this is where things like communication styles come in, where we don't do passive aggressive. Let me unpack that. One of the most powerful things I learned was different communication styles and how they affect us. A lot of us, passive is where we just go silent and we expect the other person to read our mind. Passive aggressive is where we make those remarks.
Passive aggressive grates me. This is a trigger for me.
You know what for me is even worse with passive aggressive is the people who post it on Facebook.
Okay.
Some people should know blah blah blah, and now like everybody reading it is thinking, is she talking about me? So there you are posting on social media and triggering half the people who read your post.
Okay.
Then you get aggressive, which is obvious, the shouting, the yelling, and then there's assertive. And learning to be assertive and speaking in that way tells a person, I respect myself and I respect you. And this is how it is. And, when I learned this, I've become so much more conscious of how I speak and how I address situations. So we're talking about a couple going through healing journeys of their own. Firstly, we can't expect somebody else to fix us. So that codependency is another whole topic on its own, where there's triangulation and there has to be a hero and a victim and all of that. And I think that's where a lot of relationships really struggle, where there is that codependency and there's that sense of you need to rescue me all the time because I'm so fragile and wounded. And
or even too much of an emotional merging, right?
Correct.
Because you're saying they need to start the journey on their own. So, don't forget that you're an individual.
Absolutely, and we all have our own personal journeys that we've gone through. And, not everybody has experienced major trauma, but there's always little things along the way that come up that tend to affect our sense of confidence, our sense of self-worth, our sense of identity. It could even be something as simple as losing a job or moving to a new job. We talk about grief from the perspective of death, but grief is a sense of loss, and it doesn't always mean it's a very negative situation. So if you go from one job to another job, it's a great, exciting thing. You've got a new opportunity. But there's a grieving process that takes place from having to move from those relationships, from that familiar environment, from that certain, there are certain things that
identity.
you're going to miss, that identity. And, all of these things, because we're not conscious of it and because we don't understand that this should be exciting, this should be happy, why am I feeling a little bit weird? And we don't address that, it can sometimes come out as frustration and anger, and we don't understand why.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to ask this question again, and you might get annoyed with me, but what does addressing it mean?
I would say addressing it means when you identify what your issue is. Like, for example,
So the example that you're using, right? You move on to something else. You didn't grieve the old job.
okay. So with grieving, people often talk about going through phases. So we have anger, guilt, denial, all of these things. And I think what's important is stopping and acknowledging that there has been a loss.
Okay.
And saying, okay, so what is it that I feel like I have lost? And how do I overcome that? The good thing about that type of grief is if it's a relationship, then you might make a decision that that person was important to me, so I am missing them. I might not be in that job anymore, but perhaps I need to schedule regular coffee dates with them, or maybe a phone call and keeping in touch with them. So there's always a practical way to address something that is affecting us. So if it's something that's causing us unhappiness, we might decide, okay, it's time for me to put up a boundary or shut a door.
Right. Okay. What would you say are some of the biggest misconceptions or misconception about emotional healing?
I would say that it's that there's a finish line.
Okay. Right. We're always a work of art, right? Always a
Absolutely,
developing
absolutely.
work of
Yeah.
art.
Nobody ever arrives.
Right.
Yeah.
What does true self-love look like? Not
I
massages and self-care, right? Because that's kind of what we think of.
yes.
Because we think of self-care and pampering.
I think it's-
what is it, and what do we think it is, and what is it?
I for me, what true self-love is, and I think I've realized this for myself personally because I've got two daughters, and I sometimes watch them, and I feel sad when I look at how they criticize themselves, or they'll talk about how their nose is big, or they this is ugly, or and I realize when they do those things, and I try to correct them and encourage them, how far I've come. Because I think for me, true self-love is when you look at that person in the mirror and yes, there's room to improve, but you love that person despite that. And I think loving ourselves is something that's really, really difficult to achieve. And, I went for it was I don't know, like a workshop sort of thing that this woman had a few months ago, and she said to write down the names of the five most important people in your life.
Okay.
And no, it was the four most important people. So I wrote down my husband and my two girls, and my sister had just passed away at that point, and I thought, I would normally put her name there, and I sat there for a moment completely blank, and I couldn't think of a fourth person. And eventually she said, okay, you have like a second, and I quickly wrote my name down.
Okay.
And I thought, okay, well, that's the four of us. And then she said, okay, so how many of you wrote your own name? And I put my hand up and realized I was the only person in the room who did. And I really, in that moment, realized that, it's been a journey, but to have written my name down was actually an achievement.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
What message would you give to someone who's listening in, may feeling a bit broken or emotionally exhausted today?
What gets me through those moments, and I actually feel emotional when I think about it, but it's, for me, one of the most powerful things I realized is the love, the absolute unconditional love that God has for us. And I remember very early on, when I first came to know Jesus, I started doing Bible studies because I really wanted to understand this relationship I was stepping into. And in one of the lectures, we sat in that room, and our lecturer was talking about God's love for us. And there was just such a powerful moment where I sat there and I realized that he was talking about me personally. And I truly believe that we, the Bible says that we love because he first loved us. And until we are truly able to receive love, we are unable to give it. So it's everybody. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son." And the fact that we are here because the Bible says it was the joy that was set before him that he endured the cross. That joy was the fact that it meant that we would have salvation. I know not everybody has a faith or believes in what I believe, but that for me has truly been one of the one thing. And I always say to my husband, I say, I don't know if I'd even be alive today if I had not had that moment of realization.
What does a healthy, emotionally healed life look to you?
You asked me that question, and what comes to my mind is I mentioned Brene Brown a couple times, and what I love about her is that she actually researches shame. That was how she started her journey, and she would always refer to the whole people, the wholehearted people.
Okay.
And that's how she defined someone that was, at a point where you would consider that they were emotionally fulfilled. And I love what she talks about. She talks about courage. She says they have a willingness to show up, be seen, and take emotional risks when they cannot control the outcome.
Okay.
She talks about them having compassion, being able to recognize and embrace their own flaws so that they can extend the same grace to others. So it's not perfectionism. It's being able to say, I'm not perfect, and it's okay if you're not either. It's about the way we connect. And I'm going to actually read what she says here because I wanted to get this right. She says, wholehearted individuals don't have easier lives. And I think that's a common misconception. People think that your life is perfect when you have that sense of peace. Nor are they immune to grief. And I'm just going to pause there and say that some people think that because you are strong, you are immune to emotions. I actually was insulted by a friend who said to me, "Oh, but you're so strong." When
You'll be fine.
yeah, I was like, no, it's you get strong because you go through difficult things,
Yes.
and you either become strong or become a victim. So yeah, back to what I was saying. They are not immune to grief, trauma, or failure. Instead, they share specific attitudes and resilience habits, and this is what we develop. They believe they are inherently worthy of love, belonging, and joy. They are highly resilient to shame, and I really love that because we live in such a cancel culture or a society where people love to shame each other. In fact, even without intending to, sometimes we say things that are so hurtful to others. Like we'll pick on people's complexion and weight, and I know a lot of aunties who the first thing they say when they see you is, "Oh, you gone so dark," or "You picked up so much weight. What's wrong with you?" It's weird, but it affects a lot of people. So we need to be highly resilient to shame in this day and age. And I love this. She says, they view vulnerability as the catalyst for creativity, intimacy, and bravery rather than a weakness. And I mean, it's what I'm doing today. I'm being vulnerable. I'm talking about my life. I'm laying it all out there. Like when my daughter wasn't well, we'd talk about it openly and freely. And even with men, when we talk about men having challenges with emotional health, when there's a man that's willing to, especially a highly respected man who's, respected amongst his peers and who's upstanding in society, and when he's able to stand up and say, I've been through some stuff. I respect John Bevere so much because he's such a world-renowned pastor. For him to stand up and talk about his addiction to pornography, men can look at him and say, if he's talking about it and if he's overcome it, then so can I. So, there's a space in this world for vulnerability. And in the right spaces and in the right context. It's not about posting for the whole world on social media and using it loosely, but it's about finding the right ears to listen and removing the stigma around mental health.
Beautiful. That was Laiela Dorasamy. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. If people are looking to get a hold of you, where can they find you?
Probably the easiest place to find would be on Facebook.
On Facebook?
Yeah, I'm quite
Search
active
for
on Facebook.
Laiela Dorasamy.
Laila Parak Dorasamy.
Dorasamy. Double barrel.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, very good. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Oh, it's been wonderful being here. Thank you.
Fabulous. It is 18 minutes to 9.